Hello. Tonight we are going to do a little bit different type of video. My daughter loves to hear my stories that I tell, and there's one in particular that she has asked me to share tonight on my YouTube channel. I would like to put a warning out there right now. If you are sensitive to the supernatural, this is a scary story. This is just an experience that I lived through. That I'm not in any way whatsoever a paranormal investigator. This is just something that happened to me, and I am sharing with the universe. So this particular story takes place in Washington State. When I was 21, my son and I moved to Washington, and we lived in a townhouse overlooking the Puget Sound. And it was a really neat little townhouse. It had a deck right off the front door, and below the deck was a cliff. And there were blackberry bushes that grew up the cliff. And at the bottom of this cliff was the sound. And every day there were otters playing in the water. There were, the tide would go in and out, so you'd get that nice tide smell. And there was actually a mated pair of bald eagles that lived in a pine tree above us. And so we would always see them playing with each other, and then they would like clasp talons and spin down to the ground. And so it was just a really neat place to live. And I remember my first impression of Washington State was we had been there for about 2 or 3 nights, and we actually got to see the Northern Lights. And at first I was like, whoa, what is that? Because I grew up in the desert, and so you never see the Northern Lights this far south. And so seeing these like magical green lights in the sky was just amazing. And I literally fell in love with Washington State. And at that moment, I was like, I am going to live here forever. And this was in the summer. So I hadn't yet experienced a Washington winter. Well, about a week after I moved in, my neighbor came and introduced herself to me. And she was an eccentric woman. I think she might have been a little bit older than me, but not much older. She had 3 children. And the youngest one, I want to say, was like 2 or 3. And it was kind of... So I started having a friendship with this particular woman because I didn't have anybody else. I didn't know anybody. And it was just me and my son at the time. And so this woman, she would come over and bring her kids, and we would talk, and she would ask me questions about Arizona, where I was from, just kind of getting to know one another. And one night she was over particularly late, and I had gone ahead and put my son to bed, and I talked with her for a little while longer, and after she decided she was going to go home, I went upstairs and got ready for bed as well. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, my son woke up, and he was screaming, and he had this like blood-curdling scream that I had never heard before. And I got up and I went in there and I comforted him, and I was like, everything's gonna be okay, it's all right. And I sat down next to his bed and I laid him down, and I got him to calm down. I got him to go back to sleep, and I snuck out of the room, and I had put a baby gate in the doorway so that if he were to wake up before I did, he wouldn't fall down the stairs because the townhouse I lived in, it was very narrow. It had a hallway, and then it turned like this, and immediately was a staircase. And so for his safety, I put this baby gate up. Well, I got out of the room, I went back, I laid down, and again, he woke up and he was just screaming, this blood curdling scream. And I ran in there and I picked him up and I was like, what's the matter? What's going on? And I had noticed that the temperature in his room had dropped significantly to the temperature in the rest of the house. And so each room had an independent heater. So I went in to his room and I turned the heater on and I laid him back down and I turned on his Bob and Larry Sunday morning songs. And I calmed him down, put him back to bed, and I went back into my room and I closed my eyes. And again, he woke up screaming, this blood-curdling scream, and he had crawled over to the baby gate and he was shaking this baby gate and just screaming and screaming. And I ran out of my room and I turned on the light and I picked him up so he woke up and he had gotten over to his baby gate and he was shaking the baby gate. And I got up and I ran out of my room and I went over to his door and he was just standing there and tears are pouring out of his eyes, and he's 1 at this point in time. He's only a year old and he is just screaming, and you could see that something had terrified him. And I picked him up and I was walking around the room and it was cold. It was so cold in the room that you could actually see your breath, and he was pulling at his clothes. And I was like, what is going on? And so I'm trying to figure out what's going on with him, and I'm trying to comfort him. And so I lay him down and I take his clothes off, and he has red marks all over his body that look like someone scratched him like this. And so I panicked and I picked him up and I was looking in his onesie that he had been sleeping in to see if maybe it had gotten some grass in it or something that would have caused these marks. And I went over because I thought I had turned the heater on, but the heater was turned off. So I turned it back on and I'm trying to comfort him, and I'm singing Bob and Larry Sunday morning songs, and I finally decide I've had enough, and I take him into my room and I go to sleep, and we end up falling asleep, and nothing else happened the rest of the night. So my neighbor came over the next day to see how we were doing, and I told her, I was like, we had a terrible night. And she asked me, she was like, yeah, that sounds like a terrible thing that happened. And she asked if she could see these marks that I was talking about. And so I said yes, and I took off my son's clothes and they were gone. And I was like, I told her, I said, I know this sounds like I'm crazy. I said, but I swear to you, this is real. I would never make something like this up. Something scratched him. I mean, and it was everywhere. It was everywhere. And it looked like something had picked him up like this on his back and just... So she told me, she was like, well, these are old townhouses, and she had explained to me that there was some history with these townhouses. I guess they were military housing during World War II, and so they were old. And growing up as a child, I did not grow up in a strict Christian home. I grew up hearing stories about ghosts and the spirit world, and so I was always very open-minded to the idea that there were spirits. I was never really told about the bad spirits and what could happen if a bad spirit attached itself to you or was in your presence. And then I met my in-laws at the time, And I started learning more about the Pentecostal beliefs. And I started questioning, things about it. And I struggled at first with Christianity versus. So, as a baby Christian, I struggled with how to approach this. I didn't want people to think that I was crazy, but at the same time, I just had this feeling deep in my stomach that something was wrong. And so I talked to my mother-in-law at the time, and I kind of told her what was going on, and she suggested that maybe I was stressed out. And so I asked my mom to come up, and she was in Portland at the time, and so she drove up and she spent a week with us, and I really started to feel at peace, having my mom there. I felt okay. And even my mom met this girl and was kind of like, well, she's kind of strange, but for all we knew, it was a cultural difference, because people in the Southwest versus people in the Northeast, there's going to be some differences. So I want to say it was about 6 months later. My mom was visiting us again, and I had gone downstairs with my neighbor, and she and I were doing laundry. And in the basement where the townhouses were, they were row houses like this, and in the basement, in the front part of the basement, were like community washers and dryers, and then in the back were storage units. And we were talking, and we had the door open so that we could get some ventilation. And in Washington, they have a habit of leaving all the lids open on the washing machines so that they don't get mildew inside the tubs of the washing machines. And she had been pulling her laundry out of the dryer. So both dryer doors were open, and she was folding her laundry, and we were talking. And she had asked me again. She was like, tell me about this being a Christian and what it means. And so I told her, I'm not really an authority on it. I had told her that I was a baby Christian, and so, I could only tell her like the basics. But we had gotten into a conversation about like testimony almost. Like, how did I know this was real? And so I started telling her a story that had happened to me. And it was an event that had happened to me where I was in a really bad car accident. And my car, it flipped over into an irrigation ditch. And the way that it landed, I was trapped inside the car. And the car was filling with water. And this man stepped out of a cotton field, opened the door, reached down to me, and said, "Come with me." And without even hesitating, I grabbed onto him, and he got me out of the car. And I don't even remember like climbing out of the car. All I remember was him saying, "Come with me," and I was out of the car. And then we were walking on the gravel, and he told me, he said, "Go with this man, and you'll be okay. You'll be all right." Well, when I got into the ambulance and I got to the hospital, the paramedics said that the man I described wasn't at the scene of the accident. And so it was kind of like a wow moment for me. And in my whole life, like, the Bible for us was like our history. It was like our family's history. And every time that we talked about Jesus, it was like we were talking about someone who was there, like a relative that lived on the other side of the country. They were there, And we talked about them as in present tense when, and a lot of times, like I would go to Sunday school with friends, and it was always Jesus was this, was that, and it was very confusing to me because my family was always, they were more like, oh no, he is here. And so when I got into this car accident, it just made sense that he's the one that pulled me out of the car. Why not? I'm worth saving, right? So I was telling her this story, and she was like, so you're absolutely positively sure that you're a Christian? And I said, yes, I am a Christian. And as soon as the words left my mouth, all of the doors and lids slammed shut all at once. It was like just a huge wind with no wind, just everything. Bam! So I look at my friend, and she has this very maleficent look on her face, and she says, "Are you sure you want to believe that?"